Good morning, everybody. Can we please take our seats as quickly as possible? We've got a full day and we want to start reasonably on time, please. If we can please take our seats as quickly as possible. This year we have a paperless conference, so I urge you to download the application now if you haven't done so already. It's very interactive and you'll be asked to be using it in a little while. So if you can download the application as soon as possible, that would help. Okay, good morning everybody. On behalf of FEANTSa, I would like to thank you for joining us in Berlin and welcome you to our 2018 Annual Policy Conference. The annual conference serves as a useful opportunity to not only reflect on our past year, but also to look to the future and the direction that the homeless sector is moving in. Earlier this year, FEANTSa published the third annual overview of housing exclusion in Europe, which paints a startling figure, where homelessness is rising significantly across almost all EU countries. Of course, FEANTSa's conferences don't just happen. A great deal of work goes on in the background to make these events a success. In particular, I want to thank Werena Rosenke and her team at BAGW for their support in hosting the conference in Berlin. I'd also like to thank FEANTSa's Secretariat, especially Robbie Stakelum, who have worked hard to develop this important conference program. Our keynote address by Professor Eoin O'Sullivan will provoke debate and discussion about how we move forward to 2030, while our diverse set of workshops will provide the framework that will seek to answer some key questions that we need to address if we are committed to reducing and ultimately ending homelessness. A special thank you to our plenary speakers. Leilani, Farha, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. Patrick Develtere, Principal Advisor for European Social Policy at the European Political Strategy Centre. And finally, Laia Ortiz, Deputy Mayor of Barcelona for Social Rights. FEANTSa is not alone in wanting to combat and ultimately end homelessness. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have committed our governments to ending poverty, and by extension, homelessness by 2030. The EU Agenda's Urban Poverty Partnership has also called for an EU target of ending homelessness by 2030. And FEANTSa's own Be Fair Europe, Stand Up for Homeless People campaign is working to ensure homelessness remains high on Europe's post-2020 agenda. Support, however, at the local level is hugely important in contributing to the debate and discussions around how we can end homelessness by 2030. Many in our network are providing essential and all too often emergency services to an ever-growing population in a context where their services and the people that they work for and work with face cuts to funding. While we are under pressure to respond to this rising crisis, it is important to consider and reflect on the bigger picture and how we respond to the issue of homelessness. What are the future challenges for the homeless sector, and are we equipped to respond to them? The demographics of homelessness is changing. While the number of people experiencing homelessness rises, so does the profile of people experiencing homelessness, including women, migrants, young people, the LGBTIQ community, and people with disabilities. So, do we have the correct services in place to support their specific needs? Can we broaden the principles and application of housing first to support the needs of vulnerable homeless youth or women with experience of violence? With the rising cost of housing across Europe, we need to be equipped with the correct resources and solutions to prevent households from becoming homeless and to have affordable housing stocks to move people out of shelters. Do we have the capacity to develop and deliver innovative and affordable housing solutions? Finally, the proclamation of the European Pillar of Social Rights last November recognised the right to shelter and housing. How can we practically vindicate the right to housing and take human rights-based approaches to tackling homelessness? These are just some of the important questions that each of us, as conference participants, need to discuss. And I want to thank each of you for your involvement today. I also urge you to share your experiences, practices, policies, and thoughts in those workshops and over coffee and lunch. By working together, we can and must end homelessness by 2030. Thank you. Can I invite Werena up onto the platform, please?
Lieber Eoin, liebes Team von FEANTSa, I wait if you, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ich freue mich sehr, Sie hier auch heute im Namen der Bundesarbeitsgemeinschaft Wohnungslosenhilfe, des Dachverbandes der Wohnungslosenhilfe in Deutschland begrüßen zu dürfen. Es war uns und ist uns noch eine große Freude, die diesjährige FEANTSa-Tagung hier in Berlin zu haben und damit auch die Möglichkeit zu haben, dass doch viele Kollegen aus Deutschland auch mit den Kollegen aus den anderen europäischen Ländern ins Gespräch kommen. Zukünftige Herausforderungen für den Wohnungslosenhilfesektor in Europa. Damit werden wir uns heute befassen. Und Herausforderungen gibt es in der Tat viele und keine einfachen Lösungen. Die eigene Wohnung ist mehr als ein Dach über dem Kopf. Eine Wohnung erst ermöglicht Privatheit, Schutz, Geborgenheit. Sie ist Lebens- und Lernort. In der eigenen Wohnung kann man so sein, wie man will. Und diese Möglichkeit der Selbstbestimmung fehlt auf der Straße, in der Notunterkunft, in der Billigpension. Sie fehlt auch dann, wenn man vorübergehend bei Freunden, Bekannten unterkommt, die einen jederzeit wieder vor die Tür setzen können. Jeder hat das Recht auf einen Lebensstandard, der seine und seiner Familie Gesundheit und Wohl gewährleistet, einschließlich Nahrung, Kleidung, Wohnung, ärztliche Versorgung. So lautet der Artikel 25 der Allgemeinen Erklärung der Menschenrechte. Auch in der Europäischen Sozialcharta ist das Recht auf Wohnung festgehalten. Wenn das Recht auf Wohnung handlungsleitend für uns ist, dann ergeben sich daraus folgende Handlungsfelder für den wohnungslosen Sektor. Erstens, wir müssen Wohnraum schaffen und für Menschen in Wohnungsnot und Wohnungslosigkeit erschließen. Zweitens, wir brauchen die Unterstützung im Wohnraum, um eine Wohnung nachhaltig zu sichern. Drittens, Prävention, um Wohnungsverluste zu verhindern. Viertens, ein menschenwürdiges Notversorgungssystem, wenn es trotz aller Bemühungen ihm nicht gelungen ist, die Wohnung zu erhalten. Aber wohnungslose Menschen sind nicht nur auf dem Wohnungsmarkt ausgegrenzt, sondern auch aus anderen existenziellen Lebensbereichen wie Erwerbsarbeit, Gesundheit, Bildung. Sie leben sozial sehr isoliert und ausgegrenzt, erfahren Stigmatisierung, Diskriminierung und Gewalt im öffentlichen Raum. Die verschiedenen Dimensionen der Ausgrenzung befördern und begründen auf je unterschiedliche Weise Wohnungsnot und Wohnungslosigkeit. Und zugleich ist das Leben ohne eigene Wohnung wiederum Grund dafür, dass die Ausgrenzung in den anderen Lebensbereichen und Dimensionen nicht überwunden werden kann. Deshalb ist die Wohnung so wichtig und deswegen ist unsere zentrale Herausforderung Wohnungen für Wohnungslose. Und wir müssen dafür sorgen, dass in unseren Ländern die Wohnungsfrage ganz oben auf der politischen Agenda bleibt. Im Jahr 2002 fand die FEANTSa-Jahreskonferenz ebenfalls in Berlin statt, damals zum Thema Migration und Wohnungslosigkeit. Das Thema ist uns erhalten geblieben und es ist ernster denn je, denn solange Menschen in ihren Herkunftsländern nicht ausreichend Schutz, Arbeit, Auskommen finden, werden sie versuchen, dahin zu gelangen, wo sie sich für sich und ihre Familien bessere Lebenschancen erhoffen. Aber viele verelenden hier auf den Straßen von Berlin und anderer großer Metropolen in Europa. Die Bekämpfung der globalen Ungleichheit und die Auseinandersetzung mit den Folgen der Ungleichheit ist auch für den Wohnungslosensektor in Europa eine wesentliche Herausforderung. Fehlende bezahlbare Wohnungen, unzureichende Unterbringungskapazitäten, zunehmende Straßenobdachlosigkeit, all dies bildet eine Gemengelage, in der rechtspopulistische und rechtsextreme Gruppierungen, Strömungen und Parteien in vielen europäischen Ländern versuchen, sich zu profilieren. Oft genug instrumentalisieren sie die Not wohnungsloser und armer Menschen für ihre rassistischen und demokratiefeindlichen Parolen. Dem entgegenzutreten, ist eine weitere zentrale Herausforderung für uns in unseren jeweiligen Ländern, aber auch insbesondere für uns als Europäischer Dachverband FEANTSa. Ich wünsche uns einen spannenden und fruchtbaren Austausch auf dieser Tagung, sodass wir alle gestärkt mit neuen Ideen und neuem Elan die Herausforderungen im Alltag annehmen können. Dankeschön.
I would now like to invite Professor Eoin O'Sullivan to make his keynote presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eoin, and thank you very much for FEANTSa for the invitation to address you this morning and in the challenging task of within the next 20 minutes to address how we end homelessness in Europe by 2030. But I have some suggestions. We're all familiar with the target, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. That's right. And that the principle that ensuring that no one is left behind by 2030, and that there are 17 sustainable development goals, the first goal of which is to end poverty. But I've suggested there should be a sub-goal, that is to reduce homelessness to functional zero, that is that homelessness should be rare, brief and non-recurrent in all member states by 2030. So it's consistent with the first Sustainable Development Goal, but there is no specific mention of homelessness, and I think it is useful to include that. So what are the key issues that we look at? I'm being distracted by trying to flick here when I need to actually flick over here to remind myself. So looking at the extent and nature of homelessness in the European Union, some current responses, and what are the key mechanisms that we need to put in place to reduce homelessness to functional zero by 2030. So firstly, the nature and extent. This is problematic because we only have consistent data in a very small number of countries. This is very hard to see, but it's an index of homelessness across a number of member states where we do have time series data on homelessness. And I've treated it as an index because each country currently defines homelessness in a very different way. So this just gives us an indication of trends. The top line, unfortunately, is my own country, Ireland. But if we exclude Ireland, we look at Austria, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Scotland, and England. We see in the majority of cases homelessness is on the increase. But positively for the 2030 agenda, there are 2 countries that have seen sustained reductions in homelessness over the last number of years, that is Norway and Finland. So we do have examples where homelessness has been reduced over a period of time. So we can draw on these examples in pushing forward the 2030 agenda. What was striking in looking at this document, which was produced by Eurostat to aid the European Commission in achieving the 2030 targets, is that there's no data on homelessness, but the European Commission can tell me the livestock density across the European Union, which suggests to me that because of the common agricultural policy, our statistical offices have been asked to measure this because this is economically important. So it seems to me that it is not beyond the ingenuity of our statistics office to come up with a figure for the number of homeless people in each member state if they can measure the livestock density. And there is a model, so I suggest our key action, our first one, is that the statistics office in each member state devise a methodology to measure homelessness every 2 years using Ethos Light as its conceptual framework. Because otherwise, we have no way of knowing by 2030 whether we have achieved a functional zero. And Ethos Light is probably familiar to most of you. It's for considers 6 categories: people living rough, people in emergency accommodation, people in accommodation for the homeless, people living in institutions in non-conventional dwellings, and in temporary accommodation. So there is a conceptual framework. So it's not that every statistics office will have to start from scratch. There is a conceptual framework. It's about operationalizing that. And I said, if we can do it for chickens, we can certainly do it for homeless people, I'd have thought. But are there grounds for optimism? I suggest there are. Because in one sense, paradoxically, as homelessness is increasing in most member states, more and more states, regions, and municipalities are devising strategic plans to end homelessness. And there's greater optimism, in one sense, than ever before that this can be achieved. And the reason for that optimism is the increasing research evidence on what works, both in preventing homelessness in the first instance, and the support mechanisms that can ensure sustainable and stable accommodation for people who have experienced homelessness. So we do know what works. We have a robust evidence base that I think gives us grounds for optimism for achieving this target. Sorry, that's not very well come out there, but an increasing number of countries do have homeless strategies. In the case of Germany, a regional strategy, and in the case of Belgium. But over the last decade, more and more countries have been devising strategies to end homelessness. The key element that is missing, which is the key action 2, is that the European Commission needs to develop a European homelessness strategy. And I can do no better than simply repeat here the written declaration made by our elected members of Parliament who've asked the European Commission to develop an action plan taking due account of the principle of subsidiarity, containing measures including monitoring, knowledge development, mutual learning and transnational exchange, and making full use of relevant EU instruments for funding. So this is a call for the European Parliament. As I come to later on, in the context of migration, an EU homelessness policy is all the more important. And the events we saw during the week of migrants and asylum seekers being shunted from country to country shows the importance of an EU strategy in this matter. There are 4 key challenges, I think, to get to 2030. Firstly, what I call shelterization. That is a policy that sees the provision of shelters for homeless people as a default position for responding to homelessness. Secondly, the increasing criminalization of homelessness across the European Union over the last decade or so. The increasing feminization of homelessness. And I'm not sure if this is a real word, but I've made it up. The migrationization of homelessness across Europe. And if it isn't a real word, I have copyright on it. So, And the challenge is to get from shelterization to rapid rehousing, from criminalization to social inclusion, from having the increasing feminization of homelessness to preventing family homelessness, and from migrationization to integration. I'll go through this very quickly. I literally have listed 5 substantive criticisms of the policy of shelterization. Firstly, it infantilizes individuals, prevents people from exiting. Despite rules and regulations, the violence and intimidation often encountered in shelters results in some of the most vulnerable people not entering the shelters in the very first instance. Those often with the most complex needs are excluded for all sorts of managerial reasons. The provision of care is severely adulterated by the provision of security in these institutions. And finally, just the extraordinary cost of maintaining people in shelters as they migrate from a range of different institutions. So the default position must be to move away from this as a starting point. And we do have examples from other domains. So in most countries, we have brought about a reduction in the use of congregate facilities, for example, people with an intellectual disability or people with mental health issues. And most countries have done that very successfully. This is just the case of Ireland, where from 1960 to 2016, the numbers have decreased from 20,000 to 2,000. And in some cases, people have said, well, this has resulted in people becoming homeless. Absolutely not the case for most countries, that people have been discharged from large-scale congregate facilities and have not become homeless. In the Irish case, you can see very clearly homelessness was very low up until about 2013. And the big increase in homelessness in Ireland is families. It has nothing to do with the discharge from psychiatric hospitals. So it is perfectly possible to move from 20,000 to 2,000 without having other effects. And if you depend on shelterization, as we do in Ireland, you can see the green line is the number of emergency beds in Dublin, where we've moved from 1,000 to nearly 2,500. In Finland, where they abandoned the policy of shelterization, they've moved from 2,000 beds back in 1985 to, I think it's 52 beds currently. Again, it is possible to do this. This is a picture from Juha, the Y Foundation's excellent book on shelters. This was a shelter in Finland in the 1920s and 30s. This is what they look like today, self-contained accommodation. This is a shelter in Dublin in 1950, containing about 100 beds. That was it during the week. It's still there. Nothing has changed. So I think they've cleaned up the Saint a bit, but that's about it. So our third action must be rapid rehousing must become the default position for responding to crisis homelessness, with shelters playing only a minimal emergency role. I said there is evidence from other domains that this is possible, and we have very clear evidence from Finland that closing shelters is possible. In terms of criminalisation of homelessness, we've seen in the 60s and 70s the decriminalisation in most countries of 19th century vagrancy statutes. Most countries decriminalised the issue of being a vagabond or wandering abroad or begging. But in the last decade or so, we've seen the gradual reintroduction of legislation regulating behaviour in urban public spaces and begging in particular. And it poses it differently for many of us because, on the one hand, the criminalisation of this activity is not the optimal response, but at the same time, there's a recognition that street-level activity such as begging is very harmful for homeless people. It's deeply problematic. So how do you respond to that? Let's see, across most member states, there's either national level legislation, legislation criminalising aggressive or exploitative begging, or regional level legislation regulating aggressive or exploitative begging in Europe. And I think what we need to do is move from, rather than excluding those experiencing entrenched homelessness in the cities of Europe through costly criminalisation, penalisation, the default position must be the alternative evidence-based policies of inclusion. Because we at this stage have a large evidence base that if engaged with, people engaging in problematic street behaviour, if engaged with through assertive outreach and provided with permanent supported housing, they are capable of retaining their accommodation and making significantly less use of the extraordinarily costly criminal justice systems. But said we've also seen the feminization of homelessness in recent years, problematic to measure because family homelessness and female homelessness in particular tends to be hidden in many cases. But it is quite different from single homelessness. Firstly, it's different because of the extent to which family homelessness is largely experienced by women. And secondly, that family homelessness, they are not characterized by high rates of complex social or support needs, such as addiction, mental health, as is the case for many lone adults. So they do not present with these complex needs. We see that very clearly. I'll just give an example of Dublin. These are the numbers of families that become homeless every month in Dublin for the last 2 years. And the reasons are eviction from the private rented sector or family circumstances, which is effectively overcrowding. So these are the 90% to 95% of the families entering homelessness are there because their tenancy in the private rented sector has been terminated, mainly because of an increase in rent or else to overcrowding. So there is no complex needs here. This is about prevention. So again, we need to move to the default policy and practice of targeted policy interventions for those families who experience emergency accommodation, speedy access to affordable accommodation with security. And again, all the research evidence points to that long and short-term housing subsidies are considerably less costly than emergency accommodation or transitional congregate accommodation, while offering additional substantial benefits across a whole range of psychosocial domains, particularly for the children. Migration, I said we have limited data on the extent to which migrants experience homelessness in member states, but one thing we do know that they're heterogeneous in terms of their needs and supports. And that while migrants may have very little common with one another, other that they are migrants and they're homeless, what is common across the member states is the restrictions on access to homeless services for migrants experiencing homelessness. And there's a subsidiary of that in many municipalities, local connection rules that equally block people from accessing homeless services. And that's why I said in this context, the EU Homeless Action Plan is all the more important to deal with this particular issue. So these are the 5, I think, action points that need to be taken on board if we are to move to a functional zero by 2030. But of course, people may say, have you not forgot about housing? Of course, crucial to all of this is the provision of affordable, accessible housing, that we need to restore social housing to its wider affordability role rather than the safety net or ambulance role that it has largely taken on in member states in recent years, and to be able to provide secure occupancy in the private rental sector, which ensures access and ongoing affordability, security of tenure, and adequate mechanisms of address. So by 2030, the homelessness assistance system should look like this, that for entrenched homelessness, the provision of secure, supported housing, and for what I call emergency homelessness, pointed prevention and accessible, affordable accommodation. Targeted is slightly better, but I was getting into my alliteration here of pointed prevention, so it gets us the same issue. And finally, in conclusion, you may argue that this is not tackling some of the bigger issues about housing affordability across the European Union, retrenchment in welfare states. I'll leave the final comment to my colleagues, Dennis Culhane and Steve Metru, said in a similar paper where they looked at the United States, he said, reforms of services for the homeless are futile, or some may argue that, akin to arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. We argue this approach is more like reallocating the lifeboats. While it would not have saved the Titanic, reallocating the lifeboats, and indeed adding more of them, would have saved many, many more lives. While a reformed homelessness assistance system may not solve the housing affordability crisis, it can prevent involuntary shelter stays and reduce the time people spend as homeless, thereby saving many people from the indignities and victimization of public destitution. Thank you very much.
Thank Thank you, Eoin, for a provocative presentation. We'll continue reflecting on this issue of what can we do, can we end homelessness by 2030 with the panel. So I'll invite the panelists and my co-chair, Raquel, to take their seats. Okay, I think we're all seated. We decided for this conference to do something daring, to try to be a little bit innovative. One of the daring initiatives was to make the conference paperless, and I think it worked so far, except for the European Commission. I'm not going to comment on that. But it would be useful, most of you have downloaded the app, to ask first a question to you all here in the room. We should be about 350 people. If you go on the app, there is a possibility to do a polling. It's very easy to find. I think it's the second on the list. And the question, there's two questions you find there. The first question is, do you actually believe it's realistic to end homelessness by 2030? And you can answer there. So please try to do that. You'll see the results live there, and that will be a nice intro into the discussion with the panel. There is a second question, which is more of a difficult question that requires a bit of reflection from your side, and it's about the levers that are needed to actually end homelessness by 2030. And that you have the whole panel discussion time for, and by the end, we'll have a word cloud, which shows what words you think are, what interventions, what levers are the most important. So therefore you have the whole session, the time. I don't know if this is going well. I don't see it very well. We are at, how many people? 100 people?
How do you do it? You have to go on
You have to go. My panelists are asking how to do it. You have to go on the app.
my side is
Yeah. You have to go on the app, and on the app there is the possibility to participate in the polling, and then that's what is happening there. Patrick, can you tell me who is winning there?
The no side.
The no side is winning so far.
That's because I'm not on the app.
The yes side is trying to catch up, but it doesn't work quite that well. And not sure is a minority of the people. Okay, you can continue participating in the poll. I think it's quite clear that most people in the room are quite skeptical about how realistic it is to end homelessness by 2030. That's interesting because all of you are actually working on the issue of homelessness, so you're all experts. So before we start the panel discussion, let me introduce my co-chair, Raquel Cortés, or Raquel Cortés Herrera, I think you have to say, to be totally correct in Spanish. We will try to chair the session. We'll each ask a few questions to the panelists, but if we catch up a little bit of time, we might have questions from the floor. Also there, we try to be a little bit innovative. If you have a question, also put it on the app, or if you have not downloaded the app, participate in the discussion and ask your questions through Twitter, hashtag FEANTSa 2018. If you have not downloaded the app, nor have Twitter, I think you're out. Yeah, I was looking for the right word in English. All right. And Raquel will, at the end, after the question and answer session, she will conclude this session. Eoin has already introduced the different people, so to gain time, I think we'll move directly to the questions. And first we'll go from right to left and then from left to right, so nobody feels excluded or has preferential treatment. The first question is the same question we asked to you. Let's hear from the panelists whether it's realistic to aim for ending homelessness by 2030. Patrick, would you like to start? There is microphones.
Yes, that works? Yeah. Yes, thank you, Freek. Yes, I think it's realistic, but I'm not sure if it will be done. But it is realistic. It can be done. And it is indeed part of the SDGs. But as has been said by the previous speaker, it's very hard to find a reference to homelessness in the SDGs. You have to go to SDG 11, I think, which is the one on sustainable, resilient cities, where you will find something about housing and housing rights. So it means indirectly that it's also about homelessness. And I think it's a good thing to put it there, because while we are now 4 billion people living in cities, we will be 5 billion people living in cities by the year 2030. So it means it's an enormous challenge. It's not only a challenge about homelessness, it's also a challenge about clean air. It's also a challenge about social infrastructure, about physical infrastructure. So, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do. And when I say it's realistic, but it's not sure if we will be able to do it, it's also because I think there's a difference between the developing countries and the more developed countries. We have to know that there were some 800 million people who were slum dwellers in the year 2000. There are now 1 billion, so that number is increasing. So I think in that context, it's good that we put it in the SDGs and we put it under the umbrella of sustainable cities. Now, what the developing countries are concerned, there's 60 million displaced people, and that includes the internally displaced people, but also the refugees and the slum dwellers. And indeed, I mean, if you look at the living conditions of most of those people, you can call them just people living in shacks or just homeless people. Now, how can we progress? I mean, Freek, probably that's also your question. How can we progress in a realistic way? I think we first have to work on public opinion. Because if there is little talk nowadays about homelessness in most of the member states and worldwide, also in the institutions, and I come from the European Commission, I can witness that there's very little talk about homelessness. I think it's because there's a lack of public opinion that is focusing on the problem of homelessness. And therefore, I think it's people like yourself, and I would like to applaud you for what you're doing, for the big constituency that you are creating around the issue of homelessness. So it's for people like yourself and ourselves to create that public opinion. Because the homelessness people, I mean, you know much better than myself, they are an interest group in a sense because they share material interests, but at the same time, they're not an organized group. So they're not able to mobilize. They have no voice. And even when they are more and more visible, people don't look at them. So they are visible, but they're not looked at, let alone that people would talk to them and have a conversation with them so that they can also express their interest and their point of view and explain why they are homeless. So if they cannot do it, other people will have to do it. And I think this is the kind of constituency that is here around at FEANTSa that has to do it. But I think what we also have to do, and I'm very happy with what the speaker in the introduction has brought us, we have to make it clear that it is possible, that there are solutions. Because just saying there's a major problem, I don't think that will help. We will have to show, and hopefully later we'll have the opportunity to go into more practical terms on that. We have to show that it is possible to bring people back in their homes. Not just shelter, but back in their homes.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll pass on to Leilani. Working for the UN, so you have no possibility to question the 2030 target. And I know personally that you don't question it at all, so happy to hear from you how realistic it is and how to do it.
It's not because I'm associated with the United Nations that I think the answer is yes, we absolutely can meet the target. It's because I don't work on things unless I believe I can solve them. And I think that that's the key to really good advocacy. So we don't go in half-hearted, we go in completely, all all in, as they say. And so I am all in. The target actually is, in the Sustainable Development Goals, just to be very, very clear, it is Goal 11, and it's Target 11.1, which says that states are committed to ensuring access to adequate, affordable, and secure housing for all and basic services by 2030. So it's there, because you can't do that and not end homelessness, yeah? So the word homelessness is not there, but the intention to end it is there. So why do I think yes, or how do I think yes? First of all, I don't think that governments around the world have actually tried. So all of you who said no, I think, well, if governments actually tried to end homelessness, maybe then they would be successful. But I don't think governments have tried this, save for a couple. I think it would be necessary to end homelessness to use a human rights framework. And the reason I say that is because homelessness is the failure of states to implement the right to housing. And so if homelessness is a human rights failure, it demands a human rights response. And I have articulated in several reports now what a human rights response requires. So for example, all states would have to develop and implement on an immediate basis coordinated rights-based strategies to prevent and eliminate homelessness. They would include measurable goals and timelines. They would be developed and implemented in consultation and collaboratively with stakeholders. They, like you, they would make explicit reference to international human rights law, including the right to housing and to non-discrimination. They would include monitoring, robust monitoring and review mechanisms to monitor progress. And they would incorporate claiming mechanisms for violations of human rights, including the failures of states to adequately implement these required strategies. And I'm going to stress that claiming mechanism because in my research, what I have found is where homelessness and inadequate housing is being addressed the most effectively are in states where there is either a constitutional right to housing or a legislative right, and where that right is being claimed. So if you look around the world, you'll see that the places that are exhibiting the most success, no matter how you define success, are those places where the right to housing is taken very seriously. The only concern I have is this. This is the antidote to my optimism. We know that homelessness is on the rise, and we know in most places, and we know that it really comes out of neoliberal policies of the 80s in particular until today. And those neoliberal policies are deeply embedded in every structure, legislation, policy, etc., of pretty much every society. And so it is true, it is a huge undoing that's required, a huge structural shift that's required. Why I remain optimistic is I am starting at the global level, I'm starting to see this structural shift, and where I'm seeing it most is at the city level, the local level, where cities like Barcelona are saying enough, it's unsustainable, and we're going to undo what has been done.
Thank you, Leilani. Over to Barcelona. Leia Ortiz, the Vice Mayor of Barcelona, responsible for social rights. So what do you think? Is it realistic or not?
Of course it's realistic because it's possible, and if we put to fight against homelessness as a priority, but not only from a local perspective. Now I'm not that optimistic, really, after 3 years of feeling quite alone, only with NGOs in the city, but no policy in a state level, no policy in a regional level. And when we look at which are the challenges now in Europe, no? From the 2015, in fact, the data says that it's increasing. Homelessness is increasing in Europe. Even though we have planning and we know we have more data, we made better analysis, the fact is that it is not a priority in the European agenda. I mean, housing is not, for example, in the big debates in the European semester, in the debates about the economy, but the thing is that now housing is the first problem in all the cities, not only in Barcelona or the south cities that we have really a very short public housing. The thing is that the last meeting of Eurocities, all the cities said that is the biggest problem and the biggest challenge in all Europe. But it is not a priority in the economic agenda, for example, in the European Union. And then when the keynote speaker was talking about the challenges, we have to look at them. It's talking about shelterization, so we have a really big problem of housing, to access to the right to housing. The second is criminalization. For example, in Barcelona, now there are coming many people that are not migrants, that are communitaria from Romania, for example, and they are expelled of many regions of Europe. So they are Europeans, and they are Roma people that are completely discriminated, and they have a problem also to access to the basic rights. Feminization. If we look at the economic data, we say that the inequality have increased, especially in childhood, no? In all Europe, and also having a child today is a fact of being more under poverty. So these things have to look at them as the priority. And now we are talking about the European social pillar, no? The agenda, the 2030 agenda, but we don't see a change and resources behind that. And that's why I'm not really optimistic on that. Of course, I think that the cities are innovating, are putting many resources on that, but it's impossible to do it alone, because also we have to change laws. I mean, labor market, there is a phenomenon that is also expelling many people, no, in a social exclusion. Last decade, we have really a few people that were living on the street that had a job. Now it's more than the 15% of the people that have a job but are living on the street. So what's happening with the labor market? What's happening? I mean, it's not enough, this salary, to alive. And another thing, the crisis and the decisions about the future of the public services, like health or education, is also expelling many people, no? Mental health problem. If we don't have a really strong public services, it's also another phenomenon. So, of course, it's possible, but we have to change completely the priorities and the budgets in the state level, the European level, and also in the regional level.
Thank you, Laia. I have already the impression that the more you move closer to the ground, the more the skepticism becomes evident. What's the perspective of the NGO sector? So I give the floor to you.
Yeah, my name is Dirk Hauer, and I'm head of Department of Migration and Social Security at Diakonie in Hamburg. So it's a perspective of a wealthy, big city in Germany, which itself is a wealthy and big country in the EU. Preparing for this discussion, I thought we had to say something about what do we mean by ending homelessness. What is our understanding of homelessness? I can make that short because I can refer completely to that what Professor O'Sullivan said in his introductory note. Especially his stressing of rapid rehousing instead of sheltering homeless people. So, this said, I would say, yeah, ending homelessness by 2030 is a ambitious and a challenging target, but not at all an impossible one. Some years ago, Diakonie in Hamburg, together with a few allies, published a suggestion, a program to cut down homelessness and the danger of becoming a homeless within 5 years. We made very concrete and detailed suggestions concerning building public subsidized houses for certain categories of households, households which are most endangered by becoming homeless, to suggestion for better access for those people who face severe barriers at the housing market, and so on and so on. Making better use of public ground, very, very important in cities like Hamburg. So, of course, since 2015, the target and the problems are a lot more drastically and dramatically because of the large numbers of people seeking homes and flats since 2015. But not at all, it's not an impossible target. We have the means, we have the measures, we have suggestions. In my opinion, the number one problem is, does the political will exist or doesn't it exist? That's the main problem. It's in my opinion, it's not a problem of suggestions, of ideas, of means, of measures. Is this issue on the political agenda, and are politicians on a regional, national and European level willing to face this problem seriously? And on this topic, I have I'm as skeptical as you are in Barcelona. Because to express the political will isn't a matter of making declarations. Yes, we have declarations. In Hamburg, we have declaration of the new national government in Berlin. But the point is to put these declarations into a concrete plan. What we need are concrete, clearly defined aims and targets which are measurable, which we can evaluate. And we have to define a time frame within this aims should be put into action. And if this doesn't happen, I doubt the political will. So, to end, homelessness and the threat of becoming homeless, in my opinion, the core of the problem is the failure of the housing market. So we have to face market failure in this situation. And as an economist, I would say if we have to face market failure, government has to take action and activities. That's the point.
Thank you. We'll have to swiftly move on and speed up a little bit. If not, we'll run out of time. But I already know that I'll eat a little bit into the coffee break, so no complaints about that, please. A question to the two panelists on my right-hand side. What should the role be of international bodies like the UN and the EU to ensure sufficient progress on homelessness is made? From my left side, I heard already that it's very difficult to do it alone, the political will doesn't exist, and there is references to the European level, probably implicitly also to the UN level. So maybe first, Leilani, what can the UN do to help support member states, local authorities to make progress?
Yes, this one? Yeah. I'll begin by saying, in my opinion, not controversially, that the UN human rights system has completely failed with respect to the issue of homelessness. And I am a mechanism within the UN human rights system, and I include myself in that criticism, although perhaps I'm trying to shake things up a little bit. But I would say, first, the UN system has to recognize homelessness as an egregious violation of human rights, which it has yet to do. Of course, I have articulated this, and there are a few pieces within the UN system where you'll find this, but as a human rights system, I think it has entirely failed in this regard, and please tweet it. But there is room, obviously, for much improvement. I'm not sure how familiar the audience is with different UN human rights mechanisms besides me as a mechanism, but there are many. Most European states have signed and ratified key international human rights instruments, and they are monitored every 5 years. They have to appear, 4 to 5 years, they have to appear before different UN human rights committees. And those committees are intended to hold governments accountable. We need both NGOs to be making the homelessness arguments before these committees as violations of human rights, and we need these committees to be more responsive to an understanding that homelessness is a violation of human rights and that states are not meeting their obligations in this regard. And I should say, when I use the term states, I mean all levels of government, and that is the definition under international human rights law. So it includes local government, regional government, and national government. I would say that I don't know if you know about this system called the Universal Periodic Review, but that's where governments review governments at the international level in terms of their human rights compliance. The issue of homelessness is barely mentioned in those reviews, and every government is reviewed every 5 years. So again, we need NGOs and the sector to be bringing to the UN the issue and ensure that the peers of every country are saying, you know, are you going to meet your 2030 target? I'll leave it there.
Yes, first of all, I'm a little bit uncomfortable to sit at your extreme right side. I prefer to sit over there, in fact. Okay, what can we do and what do we do at the European level? Mention has already been made of the European Pillar of Social Rights. It was proclaimed in Gothenburg on the 17th of November last year, and it was signed by the European Commission, which made the proposal, but also by the European Parliament, it means the representatives of the citizens, and also by the European Council, which means the representatives of the member states. It means it's a very strong declaration, it's a very strong commitment. And I'm very happy to see that we have reference to the homelessness problem. And I think it's thanks to communities like yourself and thanks to FEANTSa that we have reference to this thing. Now, number 19 of the 20 European Pillars of Social Rights says and reads, there should be housing and assistance for the homeless. Adequate shelter and services shall be provided to the homeless in order to promote their social inclusion. Because there are 3 chapters in the European Pillar of Social Rights. The first chapter is about equal access to the labor market. The second chapter is about fair working conditions. And the third chapter is about social protection. And it's in the third chapter that we talk about the homelessness. Now, I think this is a major shift, and I'm an optimist. I think this is the end of a long political wave which stretched from the 1980s until the financial crisis. And during that political wave, we were all convinced, or people tried to convince us, that we had to do a number of things. So there was a paradigm, a dominant theory that said, for example, that we had to liberalize the financial services and that would bring stability. But we all know it brought volatility. It also said that there would be something very strange, a trickle-down effect. If certain people would get richer, the poor would also benefit. That was the trickle-down idea. But we did see that people got excluded. and there was increasingly inequality. Now I see now that with this European Pillar of Social Rights that came 20 years after the European governments and the Commission and the Parliament ever talked about the social issue, for the first time they talked about the social policy again. So this is why I'm an optimist. I think it's very important. But I think a number of things have to be done. First of all, we have to guarantee that they keep on their minds open for European social policy. And this can be done through what we call the semester. The semester is a yearly exercise during which people from the European Commission talk to the member states. But so far, they only talked about financial issues, monetary issues, economic issues. This year, for the first time, they also talked about social issues. And there were country-specific recommendations, not only on the monetary, financial and economic issues, but also on social policy, for the very first time. But there you have to see, and I think it's important for all of you to realize, the way we do it. We have what we call a social scoreboard. The social scoreboard, in fact, brings together data, statistics, and information about a number of the principles and the rights of the European Pillar of Social Rights. And so far, nothing is being said about the issue of the right to housing and the right to shelter and the right to social protection. So I think it's up to this community to push for that. And maybe also when they will have this discussion next year, when again the European Commission will talk to the member states, that at least there would be a FEANTSa social scoreboard on homelessness. And so that you push it, so that they are forced to discuss on it. The second thing I think that we should do is also to politicize the discussion on European social policy and on the European Pillar of Social Rights. And what do I mean with politicize? It means take it out of the hands of the bureaucracy and bring it in the sphere of politics. And in order to do that, I think we have to decentralize the discussion. Don't think that the discussion will be fruitful if we only do it at the European level. We should do it at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level as well. So I think there again, this kind of a movement that we are here today, we should push also for national discussions, local discussions, regional discussions about social policy and about the discussion of homelessness. Now the third thing, and I will end there, is that we also are discussing right now the next multi-annual financial framework. It means the EU budget. And this is also a huge opportunity because we will have a unique instrument, EU Invest, which will have several windows. And one of the windows will be a social investment window, focusing on social infrastructure. And there again, I think this kind of a community should push that sufficient attention is being paid to housing under that window.
Perfect. I'll pass on to my co-chair, Raquel, otherwise...
Thanks a lot, Freek. Good morning, everybody. And first of all, let me thank FEANTSa for the invitation, for being here today with all of you to discuss on this very important topic. I will really try to stay in my role as co-chair and avoid the temptation to respond to the calls that have been directly made to the European Commission. I am particularly happy to have Patrick here today to do that for me, so I don't need to take care. But actually, I wanted to chain very swiftly with the last intervention that Patrick has done, because believe it or not, the sentiment, the feeling of loneliness that Laia was just describing a minute ago, it's a feeling that is also felt at the European Commission when it comes to discussing social policy issues, because as you may or may not know, the possibilities that the treaty gives to the European Commission to act on the social policy field are very limited. And if we don't count on the complicity and the collaboration and the cooperation of all the other levels of power and administration, but also civil society, social partners and others, there is very little we can do to push things forward. So from this point of view and from this starting point, I would like to ask a question to the two panelists on my left. Sorry, Patrick, for that. Which is, how do we create political momentum at local and national level so that we can bring this objective, which is all of us we share, forward? And how do I manage that when the European Commission takes the little initiative it can take, this echoes in the other levels, which is not necessarily happening at the moment?
Of course, to have a political momentum is to achieve the same goal, no? To put everybody, no? in the same boat. It is not easy, and especially I think to homelessness phenomena, because it's more invisible. It's not something that politicians and the states want to put in the center. When we arrived to the government, the local government in Barcelona in 2015, we tried to put in the center of the agenda, making for the first time a plan, putting the people that were living on the streets, working on that, and saying and to talk in the first place, no, about the situation, how to change. But in that moment, the media really, they wasn't interested. I mean, we tried to make also a campaign, no, but it was really, really complicated. But now that this a few months to the elections, the local elections, now the phenomenon is in the top of the agenda, no? All the political parties, no, saying now there are many people on the streets, this what's the situation, and like that. So, of course, an emergency and a crisis is the fastest way to put it in the center. But I think that we have to take in advantage our crisis, the Spanish crisis and the Catalan crisis is really related to the housing problem. So, and now we have the opportunity to change the mentality, no, related to the right to the housing. So we have a really big crisis caused by speculation, no, and a really bad behavior of the housing market and like that. But no of the laws that caused this disaster have changed already. So now we also, from the cities in all the state, we asked to the central government, to the state, to change the rental laws, for example, because it's a very specific thing. But we only have 3 years contract because the last government changed. 3 years contract, and not and we cannot control at all the increase of the rentals. So now it's a really, in Barcelona, they are increasing like 20%. This is something. And if we put the housing, no, at the core place of the political agenda and the local agenda, it can make to change everything. When we talk about homeless, we are talking the right of housing. When we are talking about settlements, we are talking about right to housing, evictions, and everything. And what we are looking in all the data that we have is that the 80% of the poverty in Barcelona is related to housing. So now we try to push, no, in all the directions, at least to change the Spanish law, and also even the new Catalan government are putting the housing at least in the center of the speeches. So it's a first step just to trying to move something related to that. And just a few words, because always when we talk to European institutions, we say, yes, we are also alone. The social agenda in Europe is not easy. But when we were to Thyssen Commissioner to talk about this, we know the competence and the power. But we have to think that this phenomena is not only social, no, it's an economic phenomenon. So. We cannot say that it's not on the European competence on control. There are many things that are doing the European Commission and, of course, the states, no, that are really making that this phenomenon increasing, because it has to do with inequality and the expression of the extreme poverty is what we see, the extreme poverty that is increasing in many countries of the European Union.
I think it's not that quite an easy question, because situations are very, very different within Germany and especially within Europe. So to build a political momentum is a question, in my opinion, from a Hamburg perspective, first of all, how to create political this momentum on a regional and national level. And I can make 2 or 4 hints concerning this. In Hamburg, we face around about 40,000 people being directly or indirectly endangered by homelessness, or are already homeless. That includes people living on the streets, people living with friends, people living in shelters, people who cannot find affordable or suitable flat on the housing market because they're poor, because they are migrants and discriminated, because they are stigmatized, and so on and so on. On the other hand, we face dramatically exploding rents. So those flats and houses that still exist getting extremely expensive. And on the other side, publicly subsidized and therefore more or less affordable homes, they're decreasing. The number of those flats are decreasing. That's a situation, I think, not only in Hamburg, and nearly every larger city in Germany and every metropolitan area in Germany. And I think it's very, very similar to Barcelona and other cities. In this situation, I don't know whether it's more hope or indeed realistic. I face a lot of initiatives facing these problems. We have demonstrations, welfare organizations like Diakonie and others face the problem, address this problem, are lobbying within this field, grassroots initiatives, and so on. I think that's very, very good. They're very, very productive, and I think some of them address this issue under the item of human rights. So that's, I think what Leilani said, I think that's important. That's important on this level of political action. In my opinion, the most difficult problem to solve is to keep all those very productive initiatives and perspectives united, and to keep them together, to make that concrete. For example, initiatives and organizations fighting homelessness should be part of demonstrations of refugee welcome initiatives, fighting the fact that refugees in Germany are stuck in the shelters, and vice versa. And those groups and organizations facing the problems of rising rents should focus on the problem of homelessness as well. So there are many different perspectives within this, the whole spectrum of housing policy, and in detail they differ, but in total they have to be united, in my opinion, and that's not so easy. And I think organizations as Diakonie, the big welfare organizations in Germany, they should be a more active part in this grassroots movement, as I say.
Many thanks for that, Dirk, and many thanks for making also, again, the transition to the next question, because in my first intervention I mentioned the importance of the national, regional, and local level in pushing forward social policy. But if there is something that I have learned in the 2 years I have been in my current position, is the importance of the partnerships we have with the civil society organizations. And so I'm going to move the spotlight to our host, and I'm going to ask to the right and the right left, what is the role for FEANTSa in this agenda of putting forward the fight against homelessness?
Thank you, Raquel. I already said that our movement, let's say that this is our movement, grassroots movement, through FEANTSa we can put pressure on the European institutions during the semester exercise. Let's build our own scoreboard and try to push it and make it very visible, put a lot of media attention to it, that the problem is indeed on the increase in every single member state except 2. Secondly, I think that it would be also very good if FEANTSa, who is aware of the different possibilities within the European Commission for funding for projects and programs for the homelessness, that they would organize workshops at the national level and even maybe at the regional level, so that all of you would be aware that there is the European Social Fund, there are funds for regional development, there are funds for aid to the most deprived. There are many different possibilities, and you can tap into those possibilities also for the different projects and programs that you would like to develop. Then why not set up a campaign on cities and regions without homeless? A campaign, cities and regions without homeless. I think it would attract a lot of attention, and if we could have a number of success stories, we could demonstrate to the other cities and regions that it is possible to tackle the problem. And then maybe the most important suggestion I would like to give is to focus on what is coming next, the next multi-annual financial framework, EU Invest. I think our sector, our movement should sit down with FEANTSa and the people from cooperative housing, the people from social housing, with urban planners, with architects, etc., with the private sector, sit down and see how we can make a change. Because indeed, as Dirk is saying, the market is failing. The market is failing. So there's a need for more social housing. There's a need for more cooperative housing. So let's make the plans and present the plans to the different institutions that matter, to the European Investment Bank, to the European Commission, etc., and say, look, we are very realistic. We are people with the boots on the ground. We are very concrete and we are very entrepreneurial. So these are our proposals. You buy it or you don't buy it. If you don't buy it, we will tell everybody that you don't want to go for it. If you buy it, we give you applause.
Very good. Yep.
Well, I think first of all, the very, very, very surplus value of organizations like FEANTSa is the exchange of ideas, the exchange of experiences, and the exchange of good practices and the exchange of not so good practices. I think sometimes we learn most out of the mistakes we make. So let's exchange our mistakes as well. So that's the first of all. Secondly, I think organizations like FEANTSa give place to work cross-border in platforms on topics which are clearly defined. The chance is colleagues coming together, working, for example, on the topic of housing first, to name one. And thirdly, of course, FEANTSa is and should be, in the future as well, a lobby organization in Brussels. Because the chance in FEANTSa is that we have one clear, defined topic: homelessness, and that's while other organizations, for example, Diakonie, have a wide spectrum in lobbying in Brussels, and sometimes it's good to focus on one point, and that's the strength FEANTSa has, I think.
I can reassure you on the last one, FEANTSa is doing very well on lobbying in Brussels.
Thank you. We'll continue doing very well. Okay, we're close to the end, but I have a few final quick questions. One is to Laia and Leilani about the local authority level, because I think that's where the lever for change actually is, even if you cannot do it alone. Leilani wrote extensively about that, and you have the experience. So if you can quickly say, like, what should happen at local level? How can things change there? And then we'll move to the final question. Yeah, okay.
Yes, even I started saying that we cannot do it alone. I think that the cities are increasingly important in changing things and changing the agenda. 70% of the people in Europe live in cities. And I think that also are the administration that is more, I don't know, people-centered agenda and people's need, no, in the everyday political agenda. So it's that why when we meet, for example, in Eurocities meeting, we talk all of us. Even if in different political colors, all of us are talking the same language when we talk about housing, homelessness, and like that. Of course, we can invest more. We can put also a priority like that. Also, we can exchange knowledge, and it's very important, and working together with FEANTSa that it's been really improving the policies that we are doing in local level. But I'm convinced that we have to be an increasing relevant actor, deciding also regional, state, and European policies. We have talked to the Commissioner, and I think that it's not. I think that the system of making decisions, of programs, of the future planning of the European Union, it is not. I don't know, understandable that the cities are not in the core of the debate, because now the main problems on Europe have a solutions, and the cities are already doing things, no, to respond to that challenge. So I think that we can make we can make more things from the local level, but also to participate in the debate.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Laia. Pass on to Leilani.
I agree with everything Laia just said. One of the concerning things that has happened that many of you know is the devolvement of housing to the local level. Even in the most centralized states in the world, housing is always done at the local level. So while there's been a transference of human rights obligations to cities and local governments, there hasn't been a commensurate transfer of resources, capacity, support, etc., from the national level, putting cities and local governments in completely untenable situations. So, you know, what can be done? I think Laia already spoke to some of that. What I would say from the international human rights side is obviously there needs to be national level governments have to recognize that if they're going to transfer their human rights obligations to local level governments, then local level governments need support, and there has to be coordination. And I wrote a report at length talking about what that might look like. I would further say that the UN system has not adequately included cities in its discussions and dialogues. It's actually crazy to me how removed cities are from all of the international human rights discussions, review mechanisms, etc. And that has to structurally change. The mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, is in the midst of developing what's, I think, going to be called a municipal manifesto, which is an attempt to bring cities from around the world into a network where they claim the right to housing, a network of cities committed to the right to housing. And I think that kind of initiative is hugely important for cities to stand up on a global scale and say, we are facing a crisis of homelessness and inadequate housing, and the response is the right to housing.
Perfect. Thank you. I have a very last question, and it's related to the word cloud result. I don't see it well from here, but I see one word quite well, housing. It's of course not rocket science. If you talk about homelessness, housing is the key lever to solve it. But we are very often confronted when we make the argument in FEANTSa that homelessness can be solved, whether it is by 2030 or by 2031 or 2032. The response very often is, yes, theoretically that's all quite nice, but actually there is no housing available for homeless people. Very quickly, everybody, a very quick reaction. Like, what do you say to people that say, well, in theory, yes, but where is the housing? Let's go from left to right this time.
Okay, first thing I would say is, okay, let's argue about 10 years or 15 years. Let's sit together and define a target, define a time frame, and define the means and measures we have to take. And if you, let's look at the facts. If indeed housing isn't available, then we have to talk about how we build more houses, how we improve the access to existing houses. There are suggestions for this, and let's talk about that and make an agenda. And if you don't want to talk that precise and that definitely, then I doubt your political will.
Yeah, I agree. We don't have to talk about time. We just start doing things differently that we have been doing until now. And one thing, it's not how many housing are there in the world. I mean, it's something really basic, it's redistribution. And also, how are we using now housing as a human right or as a common good or other things. So if we change that, we will have affordable housing.
I agree. I always say that while there may be some supply side issues, the issue of homelessness is created through a constellation of factors. And so you have to address the constellation of factors, and it can be addressed by addressing this constellation, for example, discrimination and criminalization, the financialization of housing, treating housing as a commodity. In many cities, there is supply of luxury homes. So that goes to redistribution, the redistribution issue. Yeah.
I agree with the extreme left. I agree with center left, with center right. I would add, optimism is a moral duty. Optimism is a moral duty. And secondly, look at what Obama administration has achieved with the opening door strategy. There was a double-digit drop in the number of homeless families. So if that administration can do it in the United States, we can also do it in Europe.
It seems that we have two slogans that we can pull out of this discussion. One is, if you can count chicken or cows, you can count homeless. And if the US can do it, we can do it better. You will be, you already expected me to say that. We will have the very little time, not to say no time, for questions. I had a little talk with Emma, who was monitoring the kind of questions that came on Twitter and some of the frustrations of people saying, well, where's the time for the questions? But one question is very important, and I would like to put the question to Leilani. We're talking a lot about ending homelessness by 2030. Is it possible? Is it not possible? We should be optimistic, etc. At the time we're speaking about that, the Hungarian government has made a concrete proposal to change the constitution, to make criminalization of to make homelessness in the public space an offense, to criminalize homelessness. That's so far away from the objectives that we're discussing about. And so the question is, what do we do about that? There were several people that raised that on Twitter.
First of all, we recognize that Hungary is an outlier. I'm sorry, we isolate them as an outlier. That's the first step. And we do that through a variety of means, through social media, through opinion pieces, etc. I think we need to take concerted action. I can't speak to what can be done at the Hungarian national level because I don't know the mechanisms, I've not visited there, etc. I can say from my side, I intend to try to take swift action, and please don't tweet this because we like the government to be surprised by my actions, to be, you know, yes, you get it. But I have a mechanism that's called a communication mechanism where I write a formal legal letter to the government saying the United Nations Special Rapporteur is watching, doesn't like this, it's in contravention of your human rights obligations, what do you say? Now, it is a piece of paper, and they will provide me a paper response, which is nothing. So it will then be up to you as a community to take that. We will make it public. We will run with an opinion piece. It will be up to you to then really mobilize around this. I think we need a kind of, at least a regional response from Europe saying unacceptable. I think that we should go after other heads of state in other European countries to say unacceptable. That might be a stretch, I don't know.
Perfect, we'll follow up on that with you. Just one comment to that. Yes, Hungary might be an outlier when it comes to criminalization of homelessness, but criminalization happens in other countries as well.
We have to pretend that we say they are an outlier.
Yeah. Okay. We understand. I give the very last word to Raquel, co-chair, and then you can go to your well-deserved coffee break and start then the rest of the conference. And thank you very much to the panelists.
Thanks a lot, Freek. I think it was, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, Chloe will be able to tell me that I was invited to speak at the FEANTSa and Fundación Ave Pierre presentation of the third housing exclusion overview in Europe. And already there, I said that the Commission was listening and aware to all the alarm bells that were ringed by this report, but that in spite of that, we could see some hope and some reasons for optimism in the scenario. And I think that the interventions here this morning just confirm this diagnosis. There are many reasons to be worried. There are many reasons to take this problem very seriously at all political levels. But I'm also happy to say that I'm glad that the different interveners have different extents, express also reasons for optimism. And for me, I think that the main reason for optimism that I'm taking back to the Commission is the presence of so many of you here today, which means that there is clearly on the ground a conscience, a collective conscience that Europe and the world should be doing something about this problem. From the European Commission point of view, we are aware, because we would have to be deaf not to be aware, that there is a certain state of opinion out there according to which the European Commission, the European Union could certainly be doing more than they do. I take that, but among the reasons for optimism that I see at this precise moment in time, there is Principle 19 of the European Pillar of Social Rights, which was not a given when we started thinking about this instrument and could have perfectly not been there, but was there from the very first draft I saw of this document, which means that the Commission takes seriously the need of addressing homelessness and housing exclusion in anything that wants to resemble a European social model for the 21st century. And I think that there is also a reason for optimism in the way the focus of the European semester has shifted this year, as Patrick has just explained. it might be just baby steps, but baby steps are a beginning and are a grounds to build upon. And if we just keep on accumulating baby steps, we might get somewhere. So thanks a lot for your help. We count on you to continue supporting us on this process. Thanks a lot.